I guess this begs the $1 million question. What is that missing link between reading and real life application and remembering what we read? Welcome back to the Choosing to Heal podcast. I'm so excited. I have Nick Hutchison on the podcast with me today. He is the founder of the brand and marketing agency Book Thinkers. And first off, congratulations are in order because your book, Rise of the Reader, is out today, November 1st. So congratulations.
Thank you so much. 3 years I've been working on this project, so I'm happy to see it come to life.
Wow, wow. And for anyone listening who doesn't know you yet, I can't wait to have this conversation. Today, we are talking about turning reading into action, which is exactly what your book is about, Rise of the Reader. I saw that you have read over 500 books in the past 10 years, which is just like mind blowing to me. But for anyone who doesn't know you so far, could you just give us a little bit of your story and how you got into reading and how your book came to be, just to start us off?
Of course. Yeah, I'd be happy to. Well, it might be surprising to anybody that can see my background right now, but I was not much of a reader growing up. In fact, I was more of the athlete stereotype, not much of the academic. So in middle school, high school, early college, you couldn't pay me to read a book. But going into my senior year of college, I took an internship at a local software company. And my boss at the time, Kyle, he noticed that I had about an hour commute each way. And he said something to me to the effect of, hey, listening to the same music, the same playlist for the 1000th time, it's not going to get you closer to where you want to be in life, but the right podcast might. So I was commuting 10 hours a week, if you add it all up. And so I started listening to a ton of shows. And a lot of the people being interviewed on these podcasts, they were financially successful. And that's what I was focused on at the time. And they were giving at least some credit for their success to the books that they were reading. So that's why I decided to start reading personal development books. I wanted to figure this thing out that we call life. And these podcasts are basically telling me that these books condense decades of somebody else's lived experience into days of consumption. And I thought that was the coolest thing ever. So I went to my local Barnes and Noble, and the rest is history. I mean, outside of that, I'm 29 years young. I live in the Boston, Massachusetts area. I read a lot. And my marketing agency helps hundreds of authors a year get more exposure for their books.
I love it. I feel personally called out. I literally just went and grabbed my daily smoothie, pressed play on the same playlist that I play over and over. So I think that's so relatable. And, what sticks out to me is your backstory of it was like the before you found the podcast and the book and the after. It's like that pivotal moment that's kind of life changing. And I can relate to that myself. My moment for me was when I discovered healing and what that was, which essentially is very similar to personal development healing. It's all related, right? Because when we grow, we heal. When we heal, we grow. You're talking about being a jock and you were focused on money. And I'm sure that's not the only thing that's important to you anymore. And that's just so relatable, before we discover that land of opportunity for our life, how we can be so focused on these things that don't really have true meaning and how life-changing that can be. I also love that your brand, Book Thinkers, was birthed from a place you asked yourself, like, how can I spend the most amount of time doing this thing that I've discovered that I love? And that's exactly how I got started with Choosing to Heal, was very similar. I was just like, man, this has completely changed my life. And I want to not only just do this on my days off, like, how can I make a career of this? So kindred spirits.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that sometimes we think we need a pre-existing passion in order to start a business or a podcast or something like that. But I mean, remember, at 21 years old, I still had never read a personal development book. And so it was finding this new passion, finding this new thing, and then asking myself, just like you're saying, like, how can I spend the most time doing this? And getting paid to read books, getting paid to interview authors, getting paid to help them promote their book so that their book can end up in the right hands. I mean, it's so fulfilling to me as an individual. Most people would probably hate my job, but I'm obsessed with it. And I think there's enough space on this planet today for all of us to find something just like you did as well that fulfills us on a daily basis and brings us energy. I mean, so many people work in jobs that they don't like, and I can never go back now that I know what the good life tastes like.
Yeah, totally. Absolutely. So you've kind of put yourself in a position where others look to you as the reading expert. So I'm sure you get this common question all the time, which is, Nick, how do you do it? Right. So can we talk a little bit about the struggle? I'm sure you hear so often, like, well, I just don't have time to read. Right. Or maybe they read a book, but it's just not like translating into real life change. And I use the analogy frequently with healing. We can go on Instagram and save a bunch of posts and follow a bunch of accounts, but that doesn't necessarily translate into real life change. And that's exactly what you teach inside of your book. And I'm just so curious your thoughts on why it is so hard to A, find the time to read, quote, air quotes for those of you not watching. And then, like, why is it so hard, or in your experience, to retain and implement what we're reading?
Well, I'm excited to nerd out on this subject because as I built my community, today we have about 200,000 followers across our different platforms. We do over 1 million impressions a month. And building that community, I've literally been asked those same questions thousands of times, but I didn't have a resource to point people to. So I would spend time answering a voice note or maybe typing out an email or jumping on a quick Zoom call and sharing what I had learned about this reading process. Because again, I've used these books to design what I consider to be my dream life. And it happened in a pretty quick period of time. So I thought maybe I've got to write the book on this subject. And what it forced me to do at first was almost like observe my own behavior from a third party perspective because I had never taken the time to define my own reading strategies. I was just doing it. And what I was doing was very different from what I started doing. So I knew there was something that I had to offer. And so today I have tons of strategies. We can dive into a couple of them, but I'll address some of the things that you just mentioned. So if somebody listening or watching today doesn't think they have the time to read, I love to ask this question. If I paid you $10,000 to read a book by the end of the month, do you think you could do it? And that same person typically says, well, I could read five or I could read 10. And they've fallen into my trap because now they've admitted that they can read. They're just choosing not to. I do think that reading personal development books is probably one of the most underutilized skill sets that we have available to us today that we're deliberately choosing not to use. Because again, these books condense decades of somebody else's lived experience, their best lessons into days of reading. And so you can condense time and improve your own life. You can heal as a result of these books. And so the next thing that I'll typically say to somebody is instead of trying to find time, let's think about replacing a low impact activity like scrolling on social media or watching Netflix with something a little bit more productive, like reading a great personal development book. And so, in as little as 15 minutes in the morning and 15 minutes in the evening, you can read 26 books a year, and I'll prove it to you. So 15 minutes in the morning and 15 minutes in the evening is about a half an hour a day. It is a half an hour a day, in fact. And you can read about 20 pages, even as a beginner, in 30 minutes. So 20 pages a day, 5 days a week is 100 pages a week. If most of these books, which they are, they're about 200 pages on average, that's a book every 2 weeks. That's 26 different areas of your life that you can improve by replacing a little bit of scrolling in the morning and a little bit of Netflix in the evening with something more productive. So if we've determined that we can read these books, now we've determined that we can schedule 15 minutes twice a day and we can read 26 books a year. That's how it starts. And for anybody that's like, well, there's no way I could fit 15 minutes in twice a day, like pull out your phone, look at your screen time, and then tell me that you don't have 15 minutes twice a day because so many of us were spending hours a day doing useless things on our phone. And so I know that was a lot of info that I just threw at you, but I think that's probably the place to start because we can read and we should read. I
Right.
really believe.
Such a great way to address like the I don't have time to read. I love the example that you shared, and I might not get it exactly right on the head, but I think you were at a conference of some kind and you were asking the audience, like, how many people here have read The 7 Habits of Highly Effective People? And so many people raised their hand, myself included. I've read that book, God knows how many years ago. And then you followed up by asking, how many of you can tell me the 7 habits of highly effective people? And Nick, I'll be honest, I can't tell you a single one. And I think that is a perfect illustration of exactly what you are hitting on in your book, or why your book is so needed. Because some of us, A, struggle with the motivation, which you just touched on. And what a great exercise in awareness, right? And like how easy it is to do the very thing, because it's so easy to create these obstacles in our head. And it seems so insurmountable, or reading 26 books or however many a year is just such a big thing. But like you illustrated, breaking it down in 15 minutes a day, like it's almost like, gosh, why am I not doing this? So that's the first part. But then the second part of the piece is like, okay, you've convinced me, Nick. Yes, I want to read. Yes, I want to translate all of these things into real life change. So I guess this begs the $1 million question. What is that missing link between reading and real life application and remembering what we read?
I think there are probably a few missing links, but I'm happy to address one of the biggest ones today. So sometimes I'll meet people at a conference, like the speech that you had looked at on socials, or sometimes I'll meet people on social media and we'll start a conversation. And I'd say, "Hey, Monica, tell me what you're reading." And you'd tell me, and I'd say, "Why?" And you're like, "What do you mean, why?" Well, why are you reading the book that you're reading? So one of my favorite tips is to set an intention, a
Hmm.
SMART goal for each book that we read. And SMART is an acronym a lot of us are familiar with, but I'll kind of do a quick review. So S stands for specific. Your goal needs to be specific. M stands for measurable. You need to know whether or not you've achieved your goal. You have to have a baseline of measurement. A stands for attainable. Is your goal realistic? Not $100 million by the end of the month, but maybe like implementing a few things. R stands for relevant. Is it relevant to your life? Are you emotionally connected to this book? And then T is time bound. So you want to give yourself a deadline for completion. There's a book in the business world right now that a lot of people are reading called $100 Million Leads. And it's about lead generation for your business. And unfortunately, I think a lot of people are just reading the book aimlessly. They're just hoping that it's going to change their life. But I decided to set a SMART goal and intention for the book. And so here's an example. Find and implement at least 2 lead generation strategies for my business, Book Thinkers, by the end of October. So in that goal, it's specific, it's measurable. I know whether or not I achieved it. It's attainable. It's just find and implement 2 things. One of the other things that I love to teach people because let's say I'm reading, and we could talk about some reading strategies too in a minute, but let's say I'm reading the book and by the end I have 20 potential actions that I could take. Well, 20% of them, we'll call it 4, are probably more valuable than the other 80%, the 16. I don't want to pay equal attention to everything. I want to pay most of my attention to the most valuable potential actions in the book. So that's another thing that I think about is like, yeah, I only want to implement the 20% of things that might create 80% of the change in my business.
Yeah. Oh, man. And, something that was coming up for me as you were talking was perspective related to like how we look at success or define success versus failure. And what you touched on was if we make it a SMART goal and we're setting intentions, then if we fulfill those intentions or do those 2 things, then it makes us feel so much more successful, right? Versus I'm already thinking of a personal example on I read James Clear's Atomic Habits, and that was the first book where I was like, I need to write all the notes. This is going to change my life. And I did. To this day, it's probably the most amount of notes I've taken on a book. But even now, I'm like, man, I feel so disappointed in myself because I haven't implemented all of the things. Right. And so it's such an aha moment, even for me. And that's something that I'm going to challenge myself to do. If I were to go back, grab that book off of my shelf, and set an intention, maybe it's just linking the activity to a habit and just started there, how much more like happy and proud I would feel of the action versus looking at the big picture and all of that. Like you said, these experts are putting their whole life's work sometimes into 200 pages. So gosh, that can set us up for disappointment if in 2 weeks, we're like, how come I haven't figured out, these strategies that this person has spent their whole life figuring out? So such a great tangible tip for anyone listening to just shift their perspective just a little bit, and it makes all the difference. So I love that. Thank you for sharing.
Yeah, value is totally relative. And if you're right. So many people, including myself when I first started, I didn't know whether or not a book like changed my life. I didn't know whether or not it was valuable because I was excited, but I didn't take action. So by defining something realistic that you can implement, like if you reread Atomic Habits, you could say, I'm looking to find and implement 2 habit disruption behaviors by the end of October. Just 2 things. And so now you make it harder to access your phone at night and you make it harder to access the cookies in your pantry or whatever. Now the book is a success because you've literally implemented it. Just a couple of actions makes all the difference and it will feel better for you because you'll know that the time that you spent reading and implementing it and the money you spent buying the book was worth it and it paid you back.
Yeah, absolutely. And it makes you more encouraged to go and set more habits, right? It's like once you've accomplished those two things, that feeling of accomplishment and pride is such a better motivator than like defeat and just like, man, I suck at this and I'm such a failure. We never operate well from that place, right? So
Right.
all right. So, Nick, I cannot wait to go out and buy your book, and highly encourage anyone listening to do the same, especially if you're pressing play on this episode. You're clearly a reader. You're clearly someone who is motivated to take action and change. But I was wondering if we could maybe dive into what a day in the life of Nick looks like your personal reading ritual. And I have some questions, just some rapid fire questions to ask you. But before we hop into that, I guess my first question, if we back up, is before we read the book, one of the most important things is to pick the right book. And so setting an intention, that's not going to do us much good if we're picking the wrong book. So what do you look for? I'm sure you have just a laundry list of books on your TBR. So how do you prioritize which one is next?
It's a great question. And I think a lot of people struggle with this. So I'm happy that you asked about it. When I make custom book recommendations, which I try to do for anybody that wants a book recommendation, you can always DM me at Book Thinkers on Instagram and I'll get back to you. Sometimes it takes a little bit of time, but I'll always get back and make a book recommendation. I think it all boils down to 2 questions. Is there a pain? Is there a problem that you're dealing with on a daily or weekly basis that you could overcome if you read a book about how to overcome that problem? Or is there a specific skill set that you'd like to develop and you could read a book about how somebody else developed that skill set and get a little bit closer to where you'd like to be in life? So skill acquisition, problem solving, those are kind of the 2 buckets. If somebody is dealing with a problem on a daily basis over the next 30 years, they're going to deal with that problem 11,000 times. So I'm somebody who says, I wonder if for $20 and a few hours of my time, I can read about how somebody else solved that problem and over the next 30, 50, maybe even 100 days solve it so that I don't have to deal with it 10,900 more times. Right. So I think books are great at solving problems, but books are also great at skill acquisition. Like, who do you want to be in a couple of years and what's holding you back? What's different between that person and who you are today? And can you read a book about how to accelerate that journey? So that's typically where I start. And as far as getting a custom book recommendation, anybody can DM me at Book Thinkers, tell me a problem you're facing, tell me a skill you want to develop. I'll probably ask a few more questions and I'll make a custom book recommendation to you.
So you're finally ready to start doing the work. The only problem, you have no clue where to start or what to do. That's where the Choosing to Heal community comes in. It's like a cozy virtual hangout where you can connect with others who actually get it. With our book club, step-by-step resources, and built-in accountability check-ins, you'll feel seen, validated, and supported every step of the way. And you'll gain exclusive access to my live podcast discussion where you can come chat with me and ask questions about anything we talk about here on the podcast. It's time to say goodbye to feeling stuck, alone, and overwhelmed, and hello to the tribe you didn't know you needed. Visit choosingtoheal.com/community or head to the show notes in the description of this episode to learn more. So, Nick, could you want to maybe just walk us through your personal process each time you read a new book? So, you mentioned setting an intention and writing that in the beginning of the cover. What does that process look like from start to finish? Do you ever stop reading a book?
Yeah, I have tons of things to say. So stop me whenever you want to stop me. Your question, do I ever stop reading a book? So for the first few years, I read every word of every page, and I thought that that's what reading a book meant, that you have to read everything, otherwise it doesn't count. But when I was thinking about it that way, I was optimizing for the number of books I was reading, not for the changes that I was making, right? So I was optimizing for a vanity metric, like
Mm.
I'm reading 52 books a year or 104 books. And that's the wrong type of thinking. Like these books are meant to change your life. And if you can change your life after 2 or 3 pages, like good for you. You don't have to finish a book in order to count it. Life is too short to read a bad book. So for me, again, I'm setting an intention. And if the book doesn't seem like it's going to fulfill that intention, if I thought it was about, let's just say, improving my reading skills, but now it's just a personal story about this guy, Nick Hutchison, and there's no useful stuff in there, like I'll just put the book down. If a book is meant to solve a specific problem or develop a specific skill and it's not going to do that for me, then I have to move on and read something else. The next thing that I'd like to say that I think a lot of people are doing wrong is they're reading and note taking at the same time. I think that's multitasking. I think they're two totally separate activities, and we should avoid task switching because that's very inefficient. When I'm reading a book and I filter for just actions that are related to my intention, I'll quickly highlight something or mark something off so that when I'm done with the book, I can come back to it later instead of stopping my reading session and taking a bunch of notes or something like that. When you read as a monotask, like the opposite of multitask, when you're just focused on reading a book, you can get into a state of flow the longer you stay in that activity. So you get more efficient over time if you avoid switching. And then once I'm done with a book, I'll go back and I'll look at everything that I've highlighted and then I'll reflect on it. Then I'll think about it. Another point that I think is important for everybody to understand is I love audiobooks, but they are pretty inefficient because 80% of the inputs to our brain are visual. 80%. So if you're listening to a book and you're multitasking because you're driving or you're at the gym or you're cleaning the house or something, then you're not going to get as much from that book. So I try to monotask. I try to just read a physical book, not take notes at the same time. And when I'm done reading the book, then I will go back. So I won't go through the whole book. I'll only go through what I've highlighted, what I think could potentially help me solve that problem or develop that skill set. And then I'll rewrite all of those takeaways that are valuable onto a piece of paper. So another form of repetition is writing, handwriting your notes. And I'll look at that list and I'll say, what 20% of these activities could lead to 80% of the change? What do I want to implement? And then I'll even rewrite those into an online notebook. Again, another form of repetition can help me strengthen that neural connection into an online notebook like Evernote or something. And I'll repeat those notes as many times as possible.
Yeah. So when you're going back through your highlights and you're now taking notes, are you repeating like the actual text or are you writing your thoughts on what is highlighted?
A little bit of both. I try to add additional context or simplify the actual text itself.
Gotcha. Just like you, I think there's nothing better than a physical book, getting your hands on it. It makes so much sense that when we're multitasking, we're just not going to retain. If you were in the car, though, Nick, do you maybe choose books that are less, I don't want to say intentional, but how do you fill that time if you're still wanting to get something out of your time in the car, but you don't have that full 100% attention to dedicate to it?
Let's say right now I consume 100 books a year. 75 of them are probably physical paper books, and then about 25 of them are audiobooks. I choose to listen to books that are either A, super long, or B, written in like more of a story format. So something like a biography or an autobiography. Right now, I'm going through Elon Musk's biography by Walter Isaacson. It just came out, and I'm listening to it because I'm not looking to implement anything necessarily. I'm just looking to be entertained, but also gain some context on somebody who gets brought up weekly in conversations about business and things like that. So I'm curious. I want to know the backstory of Elon, but I'm not necessarily looking to like find and implement at least two innovation strategies for my business or something like that, you know?
Right. Okay. So, my final question is When you're done reading your book, do you have like a ritual or somewhere that you categorize the book and your notes or some sort of like system? I'm just envisioning like your note-taking system, your Evernote. And I'm assuming that when you're making book suggestions, it's because you've got some sort of archive or tagging system for which books are for what purpose. But what kind of ritual do you do at the end, if any?
Yeah, and it is all detailed in the book Rise of the Reader, but I'll try to be brief. So I do rewrite my favorite takeaways, sort of the most important ones, into an online system. And it's my book title. I include the date that I read it or started it, the date that I finished it. I tag my takeaways by subject. So you can filter for notes related to money or negotiation or whatever. It's great to have access to your notes in a digital format, because when I first started taking notes, they were all on paper and I lost one of my early notebooks. And so all my book notes were gone. So it's great to back them up. Yeah, it was a little disappointing for me. But also, like, let's say you read a book on negotiation and you are heading into a car dealership and you want to buy a new car, you can go to your notes on negotiation using the Evernote app, and then boom, they're all right there for you.
Love it.
I also built out an activity tracker. So if I want to implement something, I put that activity right into my activity tracker. I actually have two different accountability groups that I meet with on a weekly basis, just with my most motivated friends. And I'll say, hey, I just finished this book, $100 Million Leads. Here's something that I'm implementing from the book. I put it in my tracker. They have visibility. And by next week, I want to have tried this or made progress against it. And so then I'll show up next week and they can see, hey, you didn't do it. What's the issue? Like, should I text you throughout the week to make sure it happened? So I have a whole bunch of different implementation systems that, again, they're all detailed in the book. They can get kind of nerdy, but
No, I
I
love
think they're
it.
all very useful.
I love nerdy, speaking my language. My next question for you was just going to be for you to elaborate on whatever you'd like to share with us as far as like top tips for implementing information, but you've already given us so much. So could you tell us a little bit more about what's in the book or maybe just your experience and journey writing the book and what that's been like for you? I've been watching you share about your book on social media and, you do share a lot about other people's books. So it's got to feel so rewarding and just fulfilling and exciting to have your own book to talk about.
Yeah, I've gained so much more respect for my author clients. I thought the writing process was going to be easier than it was. So I underestimated it. So I started the book about 3 years ago. And there were periods of time where I was very disciplined in writing every day. And then different priorities would pop up and the book would kind of fall in terms of priority. And I wouldn't get anything done for a few months, but it's finally here. I learned a lot about myself, defining these strategies, observing my own behavior. I think everybody should write a book at some point in their lives because it was very, maybe therapeutic isn't the right term, but it helped me clarify and understand how my brain works and gain a little bit more insight on myself, which was really cool. One of the things that I just mentioned was that reading is not really a solo sport. I think it's a team sport. And if you can build an accountability group, like you have your own internal book club, I think that's amazing. If you can read with your most motivated friends and you can share what you've learned with them, teaching information is another way to reorganize it, simplify it. And just because of the nature of this podcast, I want to repeat something in case I didn't, well, maybe I said this, I can't remember, but so many of us think the problems that we're dealing with are unique to us. But the fact of the matter is that about 100 billion people have lived before us. And millions of them have written books, and thousands of those books detail somebody else overcoming the same problem that you're choosing to heal right now. Don't end up living a life like passively, just hoping that things are going to change. Like, do the work, read these books for $20 in a few hours of your time. And life doesn't have to be so hard.
You touched on something that I'd like to emphasize related to accountability and how accountability is so often underestimated. And you're exactly right. So, just to share a quick story, one of the reasons I created the Choosing to Heal community was back when I was at my lowest, I was in three forms of therapy. I had individual therapy, couples, and a group therapy. And out of all three, group was by far my favorite, most effective. And that was because there was something about hearing what I was experiencing and feeling echoed back in somebody else's words. They were able to put words to things I didn't know how to put words to. And it made me feel so seen and validated and understood. And then to hear what they did, like you said, there's so many people who we think it's just us. And that's why part of my biggest mission is to make sure that everybody knows they're not alone. Like, you are not alone, no matter what terrible, traumatic, dark mess of a life or a season you're going through, you're not the only one. And that's meant to be encouraging. But so often we think that we are. You mentioned getting together in a group is just another way to solidify or drill in what it is that you're reading. And yeah, that's what we do inside of our community is we have homework, so to speak, and we have progress logs, a place to set intentions. And once you say it out loud, it's like you're accountable to other people. We can cheer each other on. But my favorite part is getting together to be able to discuss what it is that we're taking away. If it's not from the book that we're reading, then it's about the challenge that we're going through or things that we're actively engaging in. And it's such an underutilized tool.
I echo all of that back to you. I agree 1,000%.
Well, I cannot wait to read Rise of the Reader inside of Choosing to Heal, because what a great way to kick off the books that we're reading before we dive into a lot of these big topics. What a great way to sharpen our skill set and prepare to have the greatest impact, which is exactly what we're trying to do. So I guess that's a little plug for both of us, right? Is if you join the community, you'll get a little bit of Nick and we'll get to do everything that we're talking about on this episode together.
Yeah, well, thank you. Thank you for having me on and for asking great questions and showing enthusiasm.
Congratulations again. I know I said it in the beginning, but I guess I feel, as someone who's starting something new for the first time as well, that really resonates with me. And so I just feel really excited and happy along with you. So to close this out, where can people find more about you? And most importantly, where can they find your book, Rise of the Reader?
Well, I stumbled around saying this earlier, but if anybody wants a custom book recommendation from me, our most vibrant community is at Book Thinkers on Instagram. You can link in the show notes below. Just DM me about a problem you have, about a skill that you want to develop, and I might ask some follow-up questions, but I will provide a book recommendation and even hold you accountable. I'll send another follow-up message a few months later and see if you've read the book. So that's where people can go. And then there are links in the bio to the book and everything else that we have going on.